On behalf of festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to GLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed our earlier 50 sessions with some of the greatest writers of the world, including Laura Cumming, Madhuri Vijay, Erling Kage, Asma Khan, Zaini Minton Bedos, Nobel laureates Abhijit Banerjee and Professor Esther Duflo, Ruskin Bond, Elizabeth Gilbert, Elif Shafak, Gloria Steinem, and so many others. You can catch them on our Facebook page, GLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest GLF. It's been an amazing 8 weeks with over 600,000 views and a reach of over 2 million people. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our session today on GLF's Brave New World is The Shadow King, Maaza Mengiste in conversation with Nandini Nair. Maaza Mengiste was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. A Fulbright scholar and professor at Queen's College, she is the author of Beneath the Lion's Gaze and a 2018 recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. Here she talks to Nandini Nair about her new novel, The Shadow King. Maaza Mengiste's novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books. The Shadow King was in New York Times Notable Books of 2019 and in the Times 100 Must-Read Books. Nandini Nair is the literary and culture editor of Open Magazine. She writes on social and cultural issues. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest GLF. And should we drop off, and we're bound to, just hang in there and we'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, The Shadow King, Maaza Mengiste in conversation with Nandini Nair.
Hi, Maaza. It's wonderful to have you here. I think in the author's note, you described the book best, and you called it The Shadow King Tells the Story of Those Ethiopian Women Who Fought Alongside Men Who Have Remained No More Than Errant Lines in Faded Documents. And I think that absolutely wonderfully captures the spirit of your book. I know you spent a long time researching the book, and it took 10 years to come to fruition. So can we talk a little bit about that, about the challenges of writing historical fiction, of writing an important story, and how you sort of use your imagination to flesh out something that is from the past?
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. That's a really good opening question. I think that one of the things I had to understand when I decided I wanted to look at this history, I was interested in it. I had heard the stories from when I was a kid. But very early on, when I started researching, I realized there is a lot to know here. It's set, these are the early days of World War II. How much am I going to look at in order to begin to write a book? What is it that I really want to know? I was researching everything I could for a while. And then at some point, it struck me that as much information as there is about this history, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of history within that history that we don't know yet. And I started to find these very brief mentions of women, sometimes a photograph, sometimes a headline, sometimes one short article. And I realized I could spend 20 years researching, and maybe this is all I'm going to find of this stuff. And that let me know that there's a whole history beneath this that has not been written about. I don't know much about it. I want to know this thing because I have a question. And every book begins with a question. It begins with what you don't know that grabs your attention. And I understood I had found one of the many gaps in history, and I wanted to pursue that. And that's probably why it took 10 years to write. But I found this moment I didn't know about, and frankly, not many other people knew it either, except for those women who fought. And I decided to pursue that and use my imagination because, again, there just was not that much information. And it was really following the traces that they left behind, which meant the photographs that they appeared in, the locations where they were, the documents I could find about those locations, and maybe sometimes the military units that were based there, the Italians. And from that, I constructed a world.
But was there a particular question in your mind, something that you had framed and put on your notice board, for example, that led to this?
Well, I don't know if I placed anything on my board, but I will tell you that what I did do was I placed a small note on my computer pretty early on in the writing of this. And it had less to do with the research and more to do with the writing. I put a small note that said, give yourself space to fail.
Right.
And what really that meant for me and for my imaginative process was, you have got to go big. You have got to move into this territory. You've got to push your comfort levels with writing, with what you think a book can do, with what you think you can do,
Right.
and give yourself that room. And if you fail, at least it's going to be spectacular. I wanted a disaster, or I did not want a tepid failure. If I failed and people think I failed, let it be big.
Right. And if you succeed, it's also spectacularly, right? There's no in between then.
There's no in between. I mean, as for most of us as writers, as creative people, I think every project that we are working on, we are not writing that book. We're preparing ourselves for the next book. Right. And that next book should be preparation for the next book. So we continue to grow. And that's how I saw this book also.
When you talk about going big, I think this book is right, because there are multiple voices. There's a chorus that's talking. Then there are photographs that are being described. There are various viewpoints, etc. So can we talk a little bit about how did you decide to create that, for example?
Initially I didn't know what I didn't think that was the way that I would approach the book. But again, the minute I told myself, you cannot be afraid to fail. What is it that you want to do with this? I understood that the story of war, or at least the stories of history, of how we know a nation's history or a people's history, is recorded in many different ways. It's of course told through stories, but it's told also through photographs that we have of family members, photographs we take of certain events in our lives. That's how we create a history of ourselves. And it's also told through the music that we listen to, the way that a neighborhood has certain gossip about certain people, and they will never outlive that, no matter what, because that's just how gossips are. Right. This is what makes a history. It's not in a classroom, and it's not in a university or in a library. The history exists amongst the people. So how could I create a book that reflects the many different ways that we remember, and also the ways that we try to forget certain things?
Right. So that kind of brings me to the next question, which I think is also sort of fundamental to your book. Why do we not know about the women who fought in the Ethiopian War against the Italian invasion? Why are those stories not remembered?
Well, I think a few things. How do you begin to speak of war as a man who's been to war and describe a woman fighting next to you, when war is supposed to be a way to define masculinity? How do you begin to define your own masculinity and what manhood is, if you also have to contend with this woman fighting, as brave as you are, next to you? And I think that these stories got silenced because no one quite knew how to grapple with them. I think the women knew these stories. I've begun to think that they knew, and they spoke to each other in the spaces of women, in the kitchens, in the homes, in those rooms where women would gather when the men would sit on the other side. And the histories got carried down because my great-grandmother went to war. my aunts knew this. I did not know it until I happened to stumble upon it. But they had shared these stories amongst themselves. And I think this is where the stories of women were kept. No one wanted to listen because war is a man's territory.
I think it's fascinating. I think even in the novel, you mentioned it at the end about how you found out about your great grandmother having taken part in the war only once you had nearly finished the research of the book. And there was sort of an incident in your own family history about your great grandmother and the gun that comes into the novel, which you didn't know. It was a coincidence. So can we tell the audience a bit about that serendipity in a way?
Yeah, I had gone to Ethiopia for one of my it was a last minute research trip. I was supposed to have the book almost fully edited, but I needed to go look at these locations or else I was not going to turn in that book until I could go. My mother and I went, she often travels with me in Ethiopia for my research. We drove for hours, 8, 9, 10 hours a day for how many days traveling from location to location. And when we got back, I happened to mention to her one of the photographs that I have of one of my female soldiers and the stories that I was connecting to the locations. And she just casually mentioned, well, what about your great grandmother? And I remember it was at night and we were tired. And I looked at her and I could not believe that after all the years of research and conversation and she just casually mentioned this. And I asked her, why didn't you tell me this? She said, well, you didn't ask.
Oh, wow.
So she knew it. My aunts knew it. Other women in my family knew it. I did not grow up in the kitchens with them. I mean, I was in school in the United States. I missed that history that would have been passed down to me. But they spoke about it, but they didn't speak about it with the men.
Right. You left Ethiopia as a child. I think you were 5, and you grew up in the US. So what was it like sort of discovering the country as a novelist?